Hello everyone. Now, we've all surely heard the argument that socialism is utopian and it can never work because it goes against human nature or something like that. I think we're all relatively familiar with that kind of argument that people make. And I just want to show you an example of that from Whole Foods CEO John Mackey when he was on the Joe Rogan Experience podcast.
I've read widely in socialistic literature. I think I do understand it. It's a type of utopianism. It's an attempt to change human nature.
Alright, so what we heard there from John Mackey is a very common example of this kind of argument where people say socialism is utopian, and then again we see at the end of that clip he's starting to sort of make the argument that socialism is against human nature. And that exact argument has been addressed by many other YouTubers, content creators, and fellow socialists. And I'll leave a link in the description to a video addressing that specific issue. But I think that this clip from John Mackey actually shows how people often misuse the word utopian when talking about socialism. And that's because there are actually sort of two definitions of utopianism. The first definition you could use is that a utopia is some imaginary perfect society which is somewhat unrealistic and nothing ever goes wrong. And that's clearly the sense in which John Mackey is using it here. However, when we talk about socialism, we can actually also be referring to the utopian socialism tradition, which came before Marxian or scientific socialism. That's actually what I want to discuss in this video. The differences between Marxism and the older utopian socialism tradition. And the main text I'm going to be referring to is Engels's Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, where he deals with this exact issue. Part 1. What is utopian socialism? Engels starts the book by essentially giving an outline of the main figures in the utopian socialist movement, people like Robert Owen, Charles Fourier, and Henri de Saint-Simon. And these kind of utopians were effectively responding to the appalling working conditions of the early Industrial Revolution. Remember that, back in these times, people still used to work, 12 hours a day for very little pay, and, there was child labor, there were huge amounts of poor people living on the streets, etc. And they came up with the idea that people should rather be cooperating and working together, there should be more redistribution of wealth. You see that they have many of the same values that maybe, socialists today would agree with. However, the utopians believed in the primacy of reason, and they thought that once people could understand their superior reasoning about why socialism was actually desirable, people would simply be convinced and capitalism would come to an end and they would move to a new kind of socialist society. We also see that because they see socialism as this kind of universal absolute truth, it's the peak of reason and rationality, that they don't really place themselves in historical or material context the way a Marxist would. As Engels actually explains, to all these, socialism is the expression of absolute truth, reason, and justice, and is only to be discovered to conquer all the world by virtue of its own power. And as an absolute truth is independent of time, space, and of the historical development of man, it is a mere accident when and where it is discovered. So we see that these socialists actually don't have the theory of historical materialism like Marxists do. But before we can get to that, we first have to discuss Part 2, Dialectics. Dialectics is essentially a branch of philosophy which holds that all things are constantly in motion and changing. Components within a system are interconnected and influence each other. And also, you can't understand a single component of a system without understanding the context of the thing as a whole or the system as a whole. You have to look at the other parts and the way they influence each other. And thirdly, there are contradictions within and between things. And as Engels points out, nature is actually the proof of dialectics. Scientific discoveries have verified that dialectics actually explain very well how nature works. And the example Engels brings up is Darwin's theory of evolution. As he says, nature is the proof of dialectics, and it must be said for modern science that it has furnished this proof with very rich materials, increasingly daily, and thus has shown that, in the last resort, nature works dialectically and not metaphysically, that she does not move in the eternal oneness of a perpetually recurring circle, but goes through a real historical evolution. In this connection, Darwin must be named before all others. He dealt the metaphysical conception of nature the heaviest blow by his proof that all organic beings, plants, animals, and man himself, are the products of a process of evolution going on through millions of years. Of course, there are other examples of dialectics being verified by nature. For example, at the largest scale, the sun is constantly undergoing change because of nuclear fusion, changing hydrogen into helium. You could say that the universe itself is expanding and constantly going through stages of development as well. And at the smallest scale, within atoms, electrons are constantly moving between energy levels, gaining energy. The particles within substances are always vibrating. Entropy is always increasing, so things are always changing and developing in nature. And Lenin, for his part, in his work on the question of dialectics, identifies several contradictions within nature as well. So, for example, he mentions in mathematics plus and minus, differential and integral, in mechanics, action and reaction, in physics, positive and negative electricity, in chemistry, the combination and dissociation of atoms, and in social sciences, the class struggle. And so we see these dialectics now in social sciences being applied to society to understand class struggle, politics, economics, and how all these things influence each other. So Engels follows up his explanation of how dialectics is scientific with a critique of the Hegelian dialectics, the idealist dialectics of Hegel. And he says, it was suffering, in fact, from an internal and incurable contradiction. Upon the one hand, its essential proposition was the conception that human history is a process of evolution, which by its very nature cannot find its intellectual final term in the discovery of any so-called absolute truth. But on the other hand, it laid claim to being the very essence of this absolute truth. A system of natural and historical knowledge, embracing everything and final for all time, is a contradiction to the fundamental law of dialectic reasoning. And one of the limits that idealism came across, as Engels points out, is the development of the class struggle, which became very apparent in the early 19th century. Engels mentions a movement like the Chartists, for instance. And Engels says that the idealism doesn't really have an explanation for why this thing exists, because it's not looking at material conditions. It doesn't understand that there's, a bourgeoisie and a proletariat, and they have their different economic interests because of the material conditions of society, and thus they have these conflicting interests, which leads to class struggle. And so here we see the development of this Marxist theory of dialectical materialism. See that we use the dialectics because they have the worldview of science that confirmed by nature, and we're using materialism because it helps us to explain the phenomena within society, helps us to explain politics and economics and how these things work. And so we see that we are definitely taking a actually scientific worldview in order to understand society. 3. Historical materialism. Historical materialism is essentially this theory of dialectical materialism applied to history. As Engels explains, the materialist conception of history starts from the proposition that the production of the means to support human life, and next to production, the exchange of things produced, is the basis of all social structure, that in every society that has appeared in history, the manner in which wealth is distributed and society divided into classes or orders is dependent upon what is produced, how it is produced, and how the products are exchanged. From this point of view, the final causes of all social changes and political revolutions are to be sought not in men's brains, not in men's better insights into eternal truth and justice, but in changes in the modes of production and exchange. They are to be sought not in the philosophy, but in the economics of each particular epoch. And so we see that when we look at history, we have to look at the material conditions, the way things are produced, the way wealth is transferred, the way, say, commodities flow on the market, the way capital moves, in order to understand it. We don't look at the ideas, we don't look at the idealism, we don't look at the philosophy, as Engels says, we look at the economics in order to understand history. And in the rest of the book, Engels basically explains how historical materialism helps us understand the transition from feudalism to capitalism, the contradictions inherent in capitalism. He talks about extraction of surplus value, the class struggle between bourgeoisie and proletariat, and so on. And how then eventually, you get to a socialist society afterwards. But I feel that's slightly beyond the scope of this video, and it's already long enough. So we'll end it there. Alright, hopefully this video gave you some insights into the tradition of utopian socialism, how people misuse the word utopian, and why Marxism is actually not utopian. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking, subscribing, turning on the notifications so that you can see more of this content on the channel. Thank you, stay safe, and have a good day.